All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the ultimate historical story of cause and effect, the monumental French Revolution. I mean, this is a period of history that completely shattered the old world order and laid the really messy, complicated groundwork for the modern democracies we live in today. It's a fascinating, deeply human story of exactly what happens when a society simply cannot sustain its own contradictions anymore.
To make sense of this massive era, we've broken down our journey into 5 quick chapters: the oppressive old regime, sparks of the revolution, the 1789 breaking point, the reign of terror, and finally, a lasting global legacy.
Let's kick things off with Chapter 1, the oppressive old regime. To really understand the revolution, we have to understand what they were revolting against in the first place. The Ancien Regime, or Old Regime, was this incredibly outdated, deeply unequal system that actively denied basic social and political rights to the vast majority of its own people. This wasn't just a political setup, it was a rigid, uncompromising social hierarchy. It was built entirely on the idea that you were born into your specific place and you stayed there, all while the king ruled with absolute unchecked autocracy. Think about the staggering imbalance here. You had the first estate, which was the Catholic clergy, and the second estate, the nobility. Together, they made up a tiny fraction of the population, yet they held almost all the wealth and were largely exempt from paying taxes. And then you have the massive third estate, roughly 25 million people, everyone from wealthy merchants and lawyers to impoverished peasants and landless laborers. This immense group basically carried the entire burden of society on their backs for a handful of privileged elites. And this massive inequality came with a devastating human cost. Millions of impoverished peasants worked the land, and ironically, it was these poorest sections of French society that were the most heavily taxed. Just imagine trying to survive while owing dues to the absolute monarch, paying taxes to the church, and handing over rent and indirect taxes to your local lord, all while the price of basic bread just kept skyrocketing. It was a completely unsustainable existence. Which brings us to Chapter 2, Sparks of the Revolution.
So that structural inequality was the fuel, but the literal spark? A virtually bankrupt French state. They had fought a series of super costly wars, including actually funding the American Revolution. There was no central budget, the bureaucracy was incredibly corrupt, and taxation was totally arbitrary. And sitting at the very top of this massive financial mess was King Louis XVI. Now sure, he inherited a disaster, but he made the situation so much worse. Historically described as inexperienced and immature, Louis suffered from constant indecision and completely failed to pass the necessary tax reforms that would have finally forced the wealthy nobility to pay their fair share. Right at the exact same time the economy is collapsing, this cultural movement of intellectuals known as the Enlightenment emerges. These philosophers ruthlessly attacked the established order. Thinkers like Montesquieu and Voltaire contrasted France's rigid autocracy directly with the political system across the Channel and Britain, which had actually already introduced limited popular participation and some respect for individual liberty. They started asking a really dangerous question: why should the French suffer under absolute despotism? And that leads us to massively influential figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who famously declared, "Man was born free, but everywhere he is in chains." He argued that society places unnatural restraints on individuals. In his view, authority shouldn't come from a monarch's supposed divine right, but from a voluntary social contract representing the general will of the people. This gave the heavily taxed, starving French masses the inspiring romantic idea of ultimate liberation. It literally handed them the intellectual ammunition to demand change. Chapter 3, 1789, The Breaking Point. The pressure cooker finally explodes in 1789, unleashing a chain of events at a totally breathless speed. Bankrupt and desperate, King Louis XVI is forced to convene the Estates General in May, a semi-representative body that hadn't even met in over 150 years. But the voting system was totally rigged, so the first and second estates could always outvote the massive third estate. Infuriated by this, the third estate breaks away. On June 17th, they declare themselves the National Assembly. Days later, after being locked out of their hall, they gather on an indoor tennis court and swear an oath not to disband until they've drafted a brand new constitution for France. The king completely panics and starts gathering troops. In response, the people of Paris take matters into their own hands. The dramatic fall of the Bastille on July 14th proved that the common masses were now the ones dictating the future. They stormed the prison, seized gunpowder, and physically tore down the ultimate symbol of the king's despotic power.
The revolution had officially begun in the streets.
Driven by this incredible momentum, the newly formed National Assembly dismantled the feudal regime. By August, they issued this absolutely stunning document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. It established the revolutionary idea that all men are born free and equal in rights, liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It boldly stated that the nation, not the king, is the true source of all sovereignty.
It's a beautifully triumphant moment, right? But looking at this soaring achievement, we have to ask ourselves, how does a movement based on such noble, high-minded ideals suddenly plunge into extreme, terrifying violence?
That brings us to Chapter 4, the Reign of Terror. The revolution drastically shifts away from a moderate constitutional monarchy. Over the next few years, things just completely spiral. France gets hit with massive inflation, devastating food scarcity, and they go to war against absolute monarchies like Austria and Prussia, who are terrified the revolution is going to spread to them. Driven by pure desperation and the very real threat of foreign invasion, radical factions take over. They abolish the monarchy entirely to create a republic. And in January 1793, King Louis XVI is put on trial for violating the liberty of the people and is publicly executed like an ordinary criminal. The power vacuum is quickly filled by radical groups, most notably the Jacobins, who were heavily supported by the lower classes. In April 1793, a terrifying new governing body forms, the Committee of Public Safety. Led by Maximilien Robespierre, this committee supposedly aimed to defend the new republic from its enemies. But in reality, they unleashed a campaign of extreme violence, using the guillotine to ruthlessly crush anyone even suspected of disloyalty. This era, known as the Reign of Terror, saw absolutely extreme policies justified under the guise of defending liberty. But the terror became a monster that eventually consumed its own creators. Ironically, all that constant paranoia and bloodshed turned the members of the National Convention against themselves. Fearing for their own lives, they conspired against Robespierre. On July 28, 1794, Robespierre himself was taken into custody and sent to the exact same guillotine he had used on so many others. That put an abrupt end to the Reign of Terror. Finally, Chapter 5, a lasting global legacy. Stepping out of the immediate chaos, leadership passes to a more moderate, property-owning government, known as the Directory. But they were deeply corrupt, wildly inefficient, and completely failed to stabilize the nation's finances. And that weakness, it paved the way for a victorious, hugely popular military leader named Napoleon Bonaparte to seize absolute control of the government in 1799. So the revolution that started by overthrowing an absolute monarch effectively ended by crowning a new military dictator. Yet, despite ending in another autocracy, the French Revolution fundamentally transformed the world. It permanently destroyed the old feudal system and firmly established three core principles: liberty, equality, and fraternity. The idea that individual citizens should possess personal freedoms, that everyone is equal before the law regardless of their birth, and that citizens share a unified brotherhood. These ideas survived Napoleon, they survived the 19th century, and they remain the undisputed bedrock of all modern democracies today. As you reflect on this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to really ponder. The French Revolution shows us exactly what happens when an outdated system ignores the suffering of its masses and stubbornly refuses to adapt. It forces us to ask, if a society's structure is too rigid to bend to the needs of its people, is a destructive breaking point inevitable? It's a pretty profound question about the fragile nature of political systems, and one that's just as relevant in our world today as it was in Paris back in 1789.